Welcome, everyone, to our latest Genealogy Tea Time with the Sons of the American Revolution Genealogical Research Library. I am Cheri Daniels. I'm your host today, and I'm also the Director of Library and Archives here at the library. So anytime you pop into Louisville, we're directly across from the Louisville Slugger Museum. Stop in, come research your ancestors, and more than likely you'll see me too. I'm here to help you with a few other staff we've got here. And we have a couple of special guests today. So I'm kind of reverse a little bit of the normal process. Usually we go around the room and we introduce everybody to find out where you guys are coming from. And part of the premise for Genealogy Tea Time is that people can ask questions. They can ask about research challenges they may have. And that's still a possibility. We're still going to have time to do that. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with our special guests today and kind of let them give their background story. I probably will start then probably asking them a lot of questions and kind of digging into that topic, which is researching 18th century Kentucky. And so let's just dig in that way. And then probably midpoint, we'll probably kind of take a little break and have everybody else introduce themselves and tell us where they're from. And if they've got any questions, especially as you listen along, you're probably going to encounter some questions with this topic. So my first guest, we've got Rachel Grimes. I'm kind of going in the order on my screen. We've got Rachel Grimes over here. She's sitting in Kentucky with not too far from me. And then we've got Russell Mahan. He's sitting over in Utah. They both have a lot of experience now in researching 18th century Kentucky records. And so I'm going to let them kind of introduce themselves and what it is they do and talk a little bit about their projects, because while they both had that research background, their projects are very different. And so I think you guys will be really surprised and really delighted with the directions that this research can take anyone. So Rachel, I'm going to start with you. We have met before virtually. In fact, actually we were probably both at Liberty Hall when they were filming that one section. I was wandering around.
Yes, you were definitely there.
I saw myself once in one of the little clips there in the larger film. But Rachel, I'm going to let you go ahead and kind of discuss what that was.
Sure. Well, I'm a pianist and composer and multi-generational Kentuckian. So in many ways, history and genealogy has been a part of my life all along. And my grandmother was president of the Lincoln County Historical Society. And my grandfather was very interested in Civil War history and genealogy. And so I've always been sort of around it and heard a lot of these names and sort of been familiar with what I think we think of as the sort of older generation approach to genealogy. And, I was moderately interested in it, but it was as I got older, and I think we've all experienced that moment where we realize as our family members are aging, or we're seeing more pictures and things, family heirlooms for the first time, maybe, that there's a lot of stories and history that are in those images or with those family names or county history. So it just feels like it's been drawing me in my whole life. And I fell in really deep when I inherited from my dad. I was helping him move, and I have a dozen or more tubs of family photos and all kinds of amazing documents, some of which came from like the Madison County Courthouse. They were original documents from even when Kentucky was still part of Virginia. Those documents were apparently mailed back to my grandmother in the 70s because the courthouse either had put them on microfiche or perhaps had deemed them not worthy of holding on to or made some of their copies. But I have all these original deeds and a couple of bills of sale and wills from that period of time, pre the establishment of Kentucky. And it blew my mind. I mean, using a magnifier and magnifying glass and reading these things. And as a composer and a musician, it just started to take a life of its own. And I started writing what wound up being a folk opera about women throughout the history of Kentucky. And what I wanted to do is focus on a few women in my family, but also women that I'd never met, just that their story was compelling to me about some aspect of history in Kentucky. So I had wanted to find someone that was associated with Fort Boonesborough because I knew there was some family there. And I had researched Elizabeth Jones Hoy Calloway and discovered a fairly recent book by Harry Enoch and Anne Crabb that actually led me to a woman who was enslaved by Elizabeth Calloway, and her name was Dolly. And all I knew was that little shred in their book. And I started doing much more research into her history, and that has consumed me for years now. And there's a lot to say about all that research and the result of it, but that is how I kind of got much deeper into genealogy research, especially for African American history, specific to Kentucky and the area.
That's great. And for those of you, I always have to kind of clarify a little bit because with Sons of the American Revolution, since it's a national audience, yes, she mentioned the word Boonesborough. So yes, of Daniel Boone fame. So therefore, that for those of you who are not familiar with Kentucky history, that's why it was named Boonesborough for Daniel Boone. And and it's kind of, yeah, it came through the gap, and that's his trajectory northward as he goes into central Kentucky. So yeah, it's not too far from Lexington, really. I mean, just the next county down. So yeah, absolutely wonderful. And we'll dig more into Dolly's story. So that's perfect. And so let's talk a little bit about your genealogy background and what led you to your project.
Thank you. My ancestors are all from, not all, but many are from Kentucky. I'm descended from Daniel Boone's family. His brother Samuel is an ancestor of mine. And my grandfather on my mother's side was born in Lexington. And the Mahan family went into Kentucky in 1779 to 1780, when many people did. And they went to Martin Station, which was near Paris, Kentucky. And within a few months, they found themselves, along with the people from Ruddell's Station or Ruddell's Fort, captured by the British and Indians and marched to Canada and held as prisoners of war for 2.5 years. And that's the book that I wrote about. There were about 400 people there. And so I have many ancestors in Kentucky, and I made a mistake in my career. I didn't become a history professor or have a history profession position like you have, Cheri. I wasted my time instead hanging around courthouses, and I should have been a professor. But now that I'm retired, I'm doing what I really want to do, which is delve into history. And fortunately, with the time that just at the time that I retired 6 or 7 years ago, print on demand of books became available, and that changed everything. Now you don't need permission from publishers to do things, and you can move ahead, do your own research, publish. You can put your things up for sale on Amazon, and it's a great situation. But I've always loved history. Research is my favorite part of history. Each fact you find is a small piece of a big puzzle. Going through the documents, looking for information, looking for a new fact, it's simultaneously fascinating and boring. But you have to be endlessly patient and go through and search out the facts. And you have to have this motivation, but there's something creative in the process. Something long ago in some way has come alive again through what you're doing. And it's an exciting thing for me to be able to do that. For example, I did not know about the Mahans in 1780 until after I retired, and I discovered that had been lost in my family's history. We also lost the fact on my mother's side that we were descended from the Daniel Boone family, and I was able to reconnect with that. But what I like to do is associate the events of family history with the broader aspects of American history and tie them together, because what our ancestors have done is generally tied to what is happening throughout the country. And it makes it more interesting to tie it in.
And actually, I do want to take a second here and actually, I know I have a hard time doing that, but up to the screen like that, but people laugh at me about my lack of talent for this. But anyway, the Kentucky Kidnappings and Death March. This is the book that Russell he wrote. Was it right before COVID or right around COVID? I can't remember when this came out.
It took a couple of years to write it, but it came out during COVID. What I love about this, the subtitle here, The Revolutionary War at Ruddell's Fort and Martin Station. What's interesting about this is this started as basically you were trying to write a family history, weren't you, about your family's experience out here. Yeah. And then that just totally exploded for you, and you actually got into the bigger, broader picture, as you were talking about, like the social history and everything, and you discovered a lot along your way, didn't you? Yes. What was fortunate was that some of Lyman Draper's people went and interviewed two sisters who are Mahan sisters who experienced that, and they formed the narrative. That book is not a family history book. It's a history book, but I use the Mahan family to be to drive the narrative. And so I tell the broader story of what happened there. It's not like my family at Martin Station. It's the story of Martin Station and Ruddell's Fort and what happened. The march to Canada, which was quite brutal. And so, when you're ready, Cheri, I can, after Rachel goes ahead, or if you want, I can go to some of the resources that I used. That's wonderful. Since we went ahead and did talk about his project, let's go ahead, Rachel. What is yours called? And then also, because we know that you had a larger project that was aired, but you're still working on some of it. I'm gonna let you kind of get into the actual details. And in the chat, I'm going to give a link to, there is a kind of a small, kind of like what you call a trailer, maybe, of what you're producing, or an intro. Yeah,
I would call it a mini documentary. Yeah. I mean, honestly, it was one thing after another, and it became many projects. Like I said, it sort of took life in my head first. And very similar to Russell's, I was researching and sort of interested in what are the specifics of my family story and history, but that was a vehicle to also kind of explore other parallel histories of people I didn't know, or to research other aspects of what was happening. And as you said, also, Russell, to me, it was the story I was really digging into as far as the early white settlement period was as much the story of the westward expansion from the colonies and what came after that initial expansion that led to the full western expansion of the United States. And that's what fascinates me, is because when you look at these small stories that happen in these initial stations and forts that were established you start to see these patterns and recognize how that's going to influence the next few chapters of history as it moves west in the United States. And what was really my focus was as we now sort of say, the unwritten history of the women and the enslaved people and the indigenous people. That's what I was more fascinated about, because we do have more written record. Thank you to Lyman Draper and John Filson and so many others. We do have written record of some of the white men that were part of this expansion and these travels and the settlement, but we don't have much record of the women, the members of the family that were not the heads of family. Obviously not very much at all in written history of the role of enslaved people to actually building and clearing the land and protecting these forts. It was a substantial part of that history. It just wasn't documented very well. So that's a lot of what I was interested in kind of going after. So I kind of abandoned Elizabeth Calloway as my focal point for that. So I was wanting to create a song, essentially, about a woman's experience during that time. And I left her and I focused on Dolly. So in order to focus on Dolly, I wanted to do research. And it led to one thing after another. So the lyrics, there's very few lyrics in it, and it's really spoken word and not a sung song, actually come from my artistic interpretation of a record from, I think it was the 1840 Farmer's Chronicle, which was a small regional newspaper that was recalling the first celebration of the settlement at Fort Boonesborough. And I think it's fascinating that we're both here today, Russell, because I'm a descendant of the Calloway family and you're a descendant of the Boone family. And the Richard Calloway and Daniel Boone were considered, along with Richard Henderson, as the settlers of Fort Boonesborough. So anyway, we continued to research and tell that story. But so I made a song. It's part of this folk opera that focuses on a lot of other people. But then I made a film that also helps to show some of the sites and reveal some of the research. So the link you have in the chat is a short mini documentary that I made to really get at the research and the detail of Dolly's story and history that I just kept uncovering. So there's a lot to say there, but some of the footage in that video is both it's actually at Fort Logan in Stanford because we couldn't film at Fort Boonesborough, but and then there's some footage from Liberty Hall, which is a historic site in Frankfort, Kentucky, where Dolly's son lived for many years and her grandchildren. And so the research that I continue to do in bits and pieces has been so essentially supported by the records at like Liberty Hall and other places that have kept good records. And if there is one piece of advice I would give to anyone who's researching early African Americans in Kentucky history, it's to hone in on the enslavers. The enslavers had the records. If you can possibly pinpoint who the enslavers were, researching them first will help you come back around to the information you want, I think, that you're looking for that enslaved person and possibly person of color, but usually free people would have potentially come from an enslaved situation or maybe their parents. And you're going to get a lot more information and research primary sources from families like the Browns at Liberty Hall.
And that's
so
just to let people know too, like Liberty Hall, a little background on that's in the state capitol. So Liberty Hall, I mean, if you think about how far away technically from Fort Boonesborough, the Boonesborough settlement area, so then all the way up to Liberty Hall. But Liberty Hall was also built very early, though. I know it was 18th century.
1810.
Right around statehood, or was
1790. 1790.
Okay, so right before statehood. So they have, that's a historic site. They have their own archive, which is where Rachel ended up, because that's the enslaver family connection for Dolly's line. And so kind of going, sometimes you have to go forward a couple generations and then kind of come back, because sometimes that trail gets you more information that can actually uncover some more information about what you're looking for.
Yes.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's the magic.
Yeah.
Is if you research the middle part of the 1800s or even the late part, and then you work back from there. Like a death certificate of Dolly's grandson was one of the ways that I could connect Dolly with her son and where he was born. And so, yeah, you might want to go ahead in time and then back farther in time.
Yeah. And so the link we've given, that's like a small little piece about the story, about what you've been working on, and the folk opera that you said you did have a large, like an hour-long movie you did have at one point that was released. Again, my COVID timeline it was right before, wasn't it? It was played at the Filson, or was it?
It was during the fall of 21. And the folk opera is called The Way Forth. And that premiered in February 2019 with the Louisville Orchestra. And then I had a chamber music version that I did on tour. And the film there's several different film chapters, and this one is called Finding a Founding Mother. And it focuses on Dolly and the research around Dolly and her descendants. Her son was named Frederick Hart. Her grandson's Henry Hart. He was a professional musician. So I got fascinated with his life and his daughter's lives. And it just goes on and on. I've made a longer piece that's about Henry Hart and his daughter's careers. Not all of those are available, but The Way Forth as a musical piece is available. The Dolly song is very short, but that piece of music is included in the video that you have here today. And what I was essentially doing with that song was just trying to interpret, as a woman in her 80s, she lived into her 80s, looking back through her entire life enslaved and being asked to get onto a stage. I think this was in Winchester or Richmond, to be celebrated as early settlers. That had to be a lot of mixed emotions. And what has really been my focus of the last few years, and there's actually some fantastic new development that I would love to share about this, is that, for all that we've been able to uncover, it appears that Dolly is the first African-American woman to settle in Kentucky. I'm sure that there's the possibility that that's not accurate, but as far as we can tell, she may be the first Black woman to live here permanently. And she gave birth to a son in late 1775 at Fort Boonesborough. So that makes him the first child born at that fort. And Fort Boonesborough is the second established white settlement in Kentucky. So, we're talking about the very early chapter of African-American history in Kentucky, and Dolly was right there. She had all kinds of skills. She was enslaved to Richard Calloway, who was one of the settlers. And she was an invaluable member of that journey across Cumberland Gap from the Sycamore Shoals Treaty, the Transylvania Purchase, up through Cumberland Gap, up to settle Fort Boonesborough. She was essential on that trip because she was a cook. She no doubt had a role in, packing animals and scraping hides as they were killing bear and deer along the way. And she was an essential part of that story, but only until recently, her name wasn't mentioned anywhere. In fact, on the Transylvania Monument at Fort Boonesborough, which was built in the 30s, she was referred to as a Negro woman. And there's another person listed as a Negro man. And so part of my fascination was to get to the bottom of who those folks were and find out if, I could find a name and get a little more information. And so the big update, if I can just jump in with this.
Sure.
Can I share screen and show something exciting?
You have the power, so yes, go right ahead. As you do that. Unless this is part of your announcement, have you found out what his name is?
Well, I'll try to talk about it. And yes, his name is Sam, and he was enslaved to Colonel Twitty. And Colonel Twitty and Sam were killed outside of the fort. They never made it to the fort because they were killed in a raid. So Sam was on the journey most of the way there, but he was not, living in Fort Boonesborough after it was established because they didn't make it. But I will show you now this big piece of fun information to share. Sorry.
For those of you keeping track while she's doing this, sharing her screen. So far, we've talked about for 18th century. So far, we've mentioned Draper and we've mentioned Liberty Hall Archives. So far, you notice we're not going to a lot of the traditional records, just FYI. And I know we'll talk about even more. So, yeah.
So I'm going to change.
We have a question in the chat about the title of Russell's book. So I'm going to type that in while Rachel is sharing her screen.
Okay. And I got to move my chat button. All right. Where's this?
All right. We see the uncovering hidden stories.
Are you seeing this chat window here?
No, I'm seeing
Now.
the uncovering hidden stories screen.
Wonderful. So last week I was coming back from a trip to Knoxville, and I stopped by Fort Boonesborough, which is between Berea and Richmond, Kentucky, in Madison County. Nearby, this new sign is the Transylvania Monument from the 1930s that was erected by the DAR. And several years ago, after researching Dolly, I initiated a petition to ask the Kentucky State Parks to update signage around that monument to the research that we had at the time for Sam and Dolly and the indigenous history that we know now. Because if you were to walk out of your car, park your car and walk up to this Transylvania monument from the 1930s, you'd get a pretty different idea of the history of the establishment of Fort Boonesborough than what we do know now with all of the other research that's been going on. So the incredible news is that after 4 to 5 years of talking with Kentucky State Parks, they have installed new signage around the Transylvania Monument. Wow. This is the signage that it's just about 10 feet from that monument. I can show you a picture here in a minute of that. But this interpretive panel, reveals a lot of the research I did on Dolly and the research that Dr. Ann Butler did on Monk Estill. So you'll see on the left a painting that I helped rather inform, I guess, the artist Audrey Menifee create to interpret Dolly. So we created this image based on the research that I had done. So this shows her, pregnant with her soon to be born son, Frederick, outside of the fort, showing sort of her daily responsibilities. So she's chopping wood, she's preparing animals, she's cooking and doing all the kinds of things that might be part of her daily routine. And then the painting on the right, I think, came from Kentucky Historical Society. I don't know who created that, but it's of Monk Estill, another early African-American settler and explorer. Jack Hart is also talked about on this sign. To me, it's a huge, huge thing to celebrate that this signage is now installed, because there just hasn't been a lot of written interpretive signs at this particular park about the role of women and African Americans or indigenous people in the area until just recently. So then I have one other, I can show you sort of the bigger picture of what it looks like to see these new signs now with the Transylvania Monument.
By the way,
so can you see my pointer here?
I can see your pointer, yeah.
Okay. This is the 1930s Transylvania monument. So it's
not loading from, like, what I see is the uncovering hidden stories plaque, or I mean
you're not seeing the other.
We're not just seeing the new image.
Okay. Let me try again here.
Although I did see that notation in that wording, it said 15%, or is it 16%, 15% of residents in colonial Kentucky were African Americans.
Yes.
And amazing. That's amazing.
Yes.
Wow.
And again, that's a reminder. I'll try to share again, and I'll share it the right way. And that's again why, and of course women, especially by 1777, are almost half of the population there too. So why are we not telling their story? I mean, that's my question and has been for years. Why are we only writing and dictating the history of a third of the population? So for me, that has been a lot of the work to do, is to just try to fill in the blanks for the women and the folks whose story hasn't really been told. So now you should be able to see the monument with the other three signs, right? So if you're familiar with this Transylvania monument, it lists early settlers by name. It talks about the Transylvania Purchase, which was not, in my opinion, a purchase. It was a land grab, 20 million acres of land from the Cherokee Nation. So for a very little amount of silver and trade goods. 20 million acres is 2/3 of Kentucky and a good part of Tennessee.
Yeah.
So that was negotiated in the spring of 75. And as even before the writing was, the treaty was finished, people set off for establishing this fort. And, it was critical to have this at least appearance of a treaty, because Richard Henderson, the attorney from North Carolina that had initiated this trip and had hired Daniel Boone to cut the road, his whole goal was to sell parcels of land to settlers from North Carolina and Virginia. And in order to do that, he had to at least have the appearance of owning the land he was selling. What he was actually doing was completely illegal and against the colonial law, but he was aware that the colony and the crown were head to head, and the crown was pretty busy trying to deal with matters on the coast. So for a little while, he got away with this scheme. But anyway, in the end, the Transylvania colony was not established, but it did at least get families into Kentucky in this area, more families into Kentucky, and it did lead to more people buying land in the area. Interestingly enough, Daniel Boone ended up in some contentious land issues later on that had to do with, establishing ownership. So he kept moving west, as we know. But anyway, a lot of my family was born in this very area and part of this long, complicated.
We did have a question where this was. This is at Fort Boonesborough, correct?
Yes, Fort Boonesborough. And so these signs have been up about 2 weeks. So that's my big news. And I was excited to share that today, because this is a lot of work on the part of so many people. So thank you to the Kentucky State Parks, the Kentucky African American Heritage Council, the Kentucky American Indian Heritage Council, and Kentucky Historical Society. So many people participated in trying to make sure that the new language that went on these signs was appropriate for our day and our understanding now of history. So we have a sign here about Indigenous people. This is early African Americans, and this is more of a kind of contextual sign that helps to interpret this monument through today's lens.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And there's a couple things to point out. So people should go back and research the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. I think that's a very interesting story in itself. When we talk about purchase, anyway, like you said, a land grab, even the deal itself was between members who were not actually in charge of making such a deal, technically, on the Cherokee side. Even so, it was shady all around. And then also too, you mentioned Daniel Boone's legal troubles with the land. Kentucky is a meets and bounds state, so therefore you had all these little plats, little surveys that were all about a tree or a boulder or whatever, and they were so layered over each other that there were a lot of lawsuits in Kentucky, especially kind of trying to sort out the 18th century settlement and even into the 19th century. And so that is actually a really good clue as far as tracking your family down. Sometimes in those court records, people trying to challenge some of the land deals that went through. And of course, the previous genealogy tea time, I won't go into that one very much, but for Kentucky, the Secretary of State Land Office has digitized so many of the early land records, and they're high resolution. It's free. You can download their images. We do cover that in the previous tea a lot. I even demonstrated the site a little bit. And that's, again, a golden resource for 18th century Kentucky right there. But yeah, Kentucky land was messy. Let's put it that way, right? There's like
It was. And those lawsuits over land were actually rich with information, rich with people's names, where their farms were located. And also a lot of enslaved people were named by obviously just first name at that time, but that was really good information to get, because I was also trying to determine, Dolly was sold to Nathaniel Hart from Richard Calloway at some point, which is why her son, we think, took the name Hart. So I think Frederick Hart spent most of his youth working for Nathaniel Hart on his farm, which was about a mile down the road from the fort. And so it was really essential to get as much as we could about who was where, and those lawsuits, those land lawsuits really had a lot of detail about who was living where and how many enslaved men were there working on tree removal and land development. So yeah, not in your typical courthouse. And I will say that, almost all the research I've been able to do, I'd say about 80% from home, because these things are now online. There's a lot of information that people are now posting in all the various, genealogy sites, but also just more and more court records are online. So
yeah, I do have a question in the chat about whether any of the Boonesborough settler information is online, or should I go there to do some research? I will let you, Rachel, think about if there's any sites that you want to share that would be super helpful. You can put those in the chat. And then another note too about the land craziness that was 18th and early 19th century Kentucky. Henderson was not by far the only land speculator. We had many land speculators that were really trying to divvy up Kentucky and make as much money as they possibly could. So there's just a lot of hands in the pot, really, and for many years. And also think about the war years, because we're going to pivot into Russell a little bit more into the war years era. But with the war years, just think about, well, not a ton going on in the war years, a little bit too much. But boy, as soon as that's over, man, they really just all start swooping in and just, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it's important too, that I didn't really, because this was not my field of study until I dove into this project. It's important to really think of that chapter in Kentucky really from this commercial angle. It's not just about individual families that want a piece of land for themselves, which of course was a huge driver for a lot of people, but it is also because it was a commercial prospect for these developers that were coming from the colonies. So Richard Henderson was an attorney and a judge, and he was just savvy. He just knew, hey, this timing is ripe for me to get in there. He knew from people like Boone, who were very, very skilled explorers, he knew what was out there. And he also knew that the timing was really good for him to head out there and drive some stakes and plant some peach trees and corn and call it theirs, because the Crown was very busy, dealing with other immediate problems. What they were doing was illegal, but they also knew there was great potential for money. And that's what was driving them. He had no intention of really living here. He just wanted to sell the land to people that did.
And in fact, Filson, many of you have heard of Filson's account or history of Kentucky. And that was early. And if any of you have seen the Filson map of Kentucky, the early Filson map, it's a mess because it's just so off proportion. And the second edition of his book. Now, again, it was commercial. He was trying to sell this land. He was trying to drum up all of this interest in this land that had been bought up, and they needed to offload this to settlers. And so he's publishing this book. He's creating this map. And it was very popular. People were definitely buying it hook, line, and sinker, and they were coming this direction. And then he wanted George Washington to endorse his second edition of the book. And George Washington said, no, we actually need something, especially the map. We need something that is based on actual surveys instead of this is fantastical, whatever it is he has drawn. And so even now, and George Washington was very much a land speculator. He had his hands in many of those endeavors. And in fact, I believe, from what I understand, he never made it to Kentucky physically himself, but he did have investments in some of the land speculating efforts that encroached into Kentucky. But yeah, no, that was definitely a big drive of why we were heading west. A lot of money involved with all of that. So I'm going to pivot over to Russell a little bit let's talk about, because Boonesborough, we're talking about 75. So right, goodness, we're almost getting close to April 19th, Patriots Day. We're getting close. So before those first shots were fired. So kind of talk to us a little bit about what happens with the war years. I mean, once the war starts and everything, and the reason I say that is because for me personally, and this is me. I grew up in Ohio. I didn't grow up in Kentucky, but I grew up in Cincinnati, so we got a little bit of Kentucky history. And my grandparents were here, and we would visit. And I knew about Ruddell's Fort and Martin Station, but I knew a lot about the attacks on, and the thing is, mentally and maybe historically with kids, they just never really tied this to the Revolutionary War. But as an adult, I'm seeing, wow, wait, that's the war years. This is important. There's a lot going on here. So Russell, you want to kind of address some of that for us?
Sure. In 1780, it was not clear that America would win the war, and the British had not given it up by any means. And they planned in Canada the British to have an invasion of Kentucky, engineered by the British, but they sent in a couple of hundred men, and then there were about 800 plus Indians from various tribes that were involved. And they, in the spring of 1780, headed south into Kentucky. And near Cynthiana was Ruddell's Fort, and near Paris was Martin Station. And they had intended to go to Louisville, but the Indians insisted on an easy target like these forts. And they attacked there. And there was a battle of sorts around Ruddell's Fort, and they captured the people there. Martin Station, about 5 miles away, they knew that they were surrounded and that there was no point in fighting. They had about 40 soldiers against 1,000 Indians and British. There was no point in fighting. They surrendered, and they were forced, all of them, about 400 people, the settlers, to march to Fort Detroit. And some of the people were taken into the Indian camps, some of the Kentucky settlers. Others went to Montreal and were held there. I have some information on sources of research, if you would like me to go to that. Oh, you've got the book there. I saw that it was asked what the title was there, The Kentucky Kidnappings and Death March.
I'm going to type that into the chat, actually. I meant to do that, and I got distracted in our conversation.
Yeah. And it was earlier on. Anyway, would you like me to go over some of the sources of research?
Yes, because one of the things that because I read your book when it first came in as a donation. I read all the way through it. What I really liked about this book is that you addressed the fact that you try to go back to a lot of the earlier accounts, and you also addressed some of the stereotypical accounts that kind of snowballed years down the road, and how it was like, oh, everybody was just massacred, everyone was just killed, and where you kind of burrowed down into the actual numbers, how many were killed, what wasn't. One of the things that really, really, really shocked me, because I just, again, younger person years ago, wasn't paying much attention, but the fact that the British were right there. The British were right there when both of these places were attacked. They were right there. This was a joint force. It was, you did make a comment, it was hard for them to necessarily control or contain the indigenous groups that were there, but they were there. That's,
right. When the settlers at Ruddell's Fort surrendered, they were in the process of still working that out. And when the Indians just descended upon the settlers, grabbing every one of them to be taken home as prisoners or as their own slaves. There were a few people killed. The British could not stop it. And when it was a fiasco, and there are various stories about how many were killed. There were a number that were killed, but probably several is the best word for that. It might have been only a few, but more were killed on the march to Kentucky. It was a reign of terror on the captives that were held by the Indians. People were being killed periodically along the way, and it was what I use the term death march, because they were killed as they went. The prisoners held by the British, which included my ancestors, they were not subjected to the same treatment. It was a rigorous march, but they were not killed along the way.
Because after the attacks, they were basically split up, weren't they? Half
Yes.
went with the tribe, and then the other went with the British. Is that correct?
Theoretically, the people from Martin Station were captured by the British, and those from Ruddell's Fort went to the Indians. I do want to mention one point. I do believe that most of the settlers that were captured by the British and the Indians were loyalists, and which is an ironic twist. And when the commander at Fort Detroit found out about this, he said, if I had known what kind of settlers those were, we wouldn't have done that. And
I'm glad you're bringing this up. This was actually a wonderful theory. I loved, and I read this in your book. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Yeah, dig deeper into that. Why is it that because I know you had some theories about where they came from and what it was like they were leaving versus facing the frontier, and then also what happened once they were prisoners and what happened to them there. So I'll let you dig into that a little bit.
The Mahans were loyalists. Not loyal. They were patriots. But their in-laws, the LaForces, who came over with them, they were descended from the French, and they were loyalists. And a number of settlers went to Kentucky to get away from the Revolutionary War and to be free of that. And quite a number of the men volunteered to be in the British Army. Of course, they were given the choice: do you want to be in the British Army or do you want to be a prisoner? And quite a few of them chose to be soldiers for the British. But I do think it is a fair statement to say most of them were loyalists. But it's an interesting irony that they go to all this trouble and dislocate these people in such a terrible way who were really on their side. So it was an interesting situation. I can, if you would like me, I could go over some of the resources.
Yeah.
Okay. The world's biggest library is online, and it's called archive.org. Most of you have probably heard of that. What's great is it's word searchable. It's basically public domain old books. But there are some newer ones in there too. And that is like this fantastical old library that you can go to. And there's also, of course, online, there can be resources anywhere. One of the problems of history is that nobody owns it. The government doesn't own it. The historical societies don't own it. History is just out there, and the records are scattered everywhere in a very disorganized fashion. A lot of things in private hands, and of course that's the way it should be. But it makes it a challenge to gather the facts together and find out what happened. If you want a hard copy of a book that you can't buy, and you're wondering what library near you may have that book, you can go to worldcat.org, cat for catalog, worldcat.org, and put in the name of the book, and it will tell you, for the participating libraries, which are many, where the closest library is to you that has that book. Then there are the Draper manuscripts. In the 1840s, Lyman Draper sent out innumerable people to interview the old pioneers of Kentucky and what they call the Trans-Allegheny West. And they got a fantastical amount of interviews, 500 volumes roughly, and they're great resources. You have to be careful with them. Those interviewers, it's not like today where they just write down a word for word what people say. There's a lot of interpretation, but it's a great resource at the Wisconsin Historical Society. A lot of it is online where people have put individual things online, but if you want something specific, you may have to go into a library somewhere and stick your head in a microfilm machine and find it.
Yes, for Draper. We do have Draper. We have a copy of the collection on microfilm here at the SAR library. I know there's several in the region of Kentucky. I know a lot of places have that. But again, yes, he's correct on that. It's never been fully digitized, and nor has it been fully indexed. There's no comprehensive index. There are the calendar series, and I always tell people there's about 6 places you've got to look to try to look at all these different indexes to see if your family's in there. And then, yes, a lot of times, what he's talking about as far as people that have digitized some things or have put some things up, there's been for years, people have extracted parts of Draper they've made books out of sections to tell parts and chapters of our history, especially like some Revolutionary War battles and things like that. And so, yes, it's still a little bit of an old school. I would love it if they digitized that sucker, but they have not.
That would be a huge project. But also there are Revolutionary War soldier pension applications, which have great information, especially for Kentucky, the Southern Campaign's Revolutionary War pension statements. Those are online and you can search by name. Of course, people didn't spell names right a lot of the time, and you have to use a lot of variations. There are, of course, we've discussed land records and court records. There's Family Search and Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.com. Family Search is free. You have to pay to belong to Ancestry, but they've got a lot of information there. And there's newspapers.com and genealogybank.com, which are old newspapers, and you can search them by name. And now there was no newspaper in Kentucky until 1787, I think it was, with the Kentucky Gazette. But and then there are local libraries. Libraries don't put stuff online generally, but if you have ancestors in a certain area, you can go to those, like in Paris, Kentucky. You can go to the library there, and they have a little genealogy section, and they have files on different names, and they have good local information that you may not find anywhere else.
I I think I believe the Kentucky Gazette has been digitized. Well, I know UK was digitizing Kentucky Gazette. I want to say the Chronicling America from the Library of Congress may have that up, a digitized copy. I put Chronicling America in there. I will, while you continue, I will look, make sure Kentucky Gazette's in there.
And then there are private collections, and there are biographies. One book, I don't know if it's going to show up here. If you can see The Voice of the Frontier, it's John Bradford's Notes on Kentucky. These are early 1800s accounts of many things that happened in early Kentucky history. And even though they are written sometimes secondhand, people who were involved were still alive then. And if there's a failure to respond to those and say, no, that wasn't quite right, then it's a great resource. So there are just innumerable sources of history scattered to the four winds, and the challenges, and it's an exciting one. It isn't just difficult, it's a challenge that is enjoyable to master and find the facts and make the story. And you put a fact here and you put a fact there, and then you start finding, well, wait a minute, there's a story here, and maybe somebody hasn't told that story, and or in the way that you can see it. And it's out there, and it's a challenge, and it's a fun challenge.
So a couple things I noticed are noted while he was talking. So Kentucky Gazette is in Library of Congress. However, here's a fun little fact. It is spelled from the early inception, 1787 to 89. It is spelled Kentucke Gazette. And that is how Library of Congress has put it in, because that's the official title. So therefore, if we're searching for why Kentucky Gazette, we're not going to find that. So just FYI, Library of Congress does have that digitized up in Chronicling America. So you can go through those. Those are really fantastic resources. Also, too, when he mentioned archive.gov, which is the Internet Archive, one of the gems I know that he has really used a lot for his book is that he was talking about especially the older accounts. So what happens with places like Internet Archive, and Hathi Trust is another one, and even Google Books sometimes, they're basically digitizing books that are outside of copyright restrictions, and so that they make them really available for everyone. So like that gets you a lot of those early histories. And so having those early histories full text searchable, that's fantastic. I know that's how you got probably a lot of the earlier accounts is from some older publications.
Yeah, it's an interesting point on the public domain issue. Books were moving along that, a year would drop off and then another one into the public domain back in the 1920s, and then it all stopped. And it's just an interesting fact. It was the public domain was stopped in the early 1920s by Congress because of Mickey Mouse.
Yeah.
Disney had the power to stop Mickey Mouse from falling into the public domain. And that is why, as I understand it anyway, the books that should now be in the public domain aren't.
They're coming back. They are releasing some. Mickey did get a pass, so clearly Mickey is still protected. However, they are starting to release more. Like we're in like 1926, 27 now. I'm noticing that they're coming out with some stuff. But I was just like, yeah, that Mickey put the brakes on stuff for a while. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Another thing too, I think that I'm just going to make a point about something, just because language is important, and so we do say things like so. You'll have heard Russell refer to the tribes that were with Britain as Indians. And then there's also Native Americans, there's Indigenous, there's First Nations. And one of the things that I have come to terms with myself is being trying to be respectful. However, all of those terms technically are respectful depending on, and it's kind of kind of probably the best practice is if you're speaking with a person, tribal affiliation, ask them what their preference is, honestly, because one of my favorite people in the world, Anita Frager Smith, she's down in she married into the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And one of the first things she tells us with the genealogy program is she says, the Eastern Band want to be known as Indians. Just FYI. And so she's like, she lays that lesson out right away. However, there are other groups that do not. Like, they don't like that word. And so just wanted to clarify in case anybody was kind of, a little nervous about us using that word. That actually is, depending on the tribal group. Now, I'm not aware, though. I'm not actually sure of the preference for, was it the Shawnee that was with the British in these actions? I don't remember. Was it Shawnee?
Yes, and Cherokee.
Okay.
Chickamauga, probably.
And sorry. Yeah, one of the things that is sadly lacking in this whole Martin Station story is that is the Indian side. We have British records, we have the settler records and accounts, but we don't have written records from the Indians, and it's too bad. It's hard to overcome that loss of information.
Yeah. I will, just since I gave her a shout out, I will say that down in Cherokee, North Carolina, they do have a really good archive down there for that area. It wouldn't help you with Ruddell's Fort Martin Station, however. But they're one tribe that I do know that locally in the region that actually has a really good archive down there. Give them a shout out because they have a fantastic museum and archive and everything, and just really, really great down there. But yes. So far this has been fantastic. Anything hitting either one of you that you want to cover?
I would just say one more thing if I could. Back in the 1980s, I was trying to do a magazine called Revolutionary War Magazine. And there were so many difficulties then that are now solved. And we have computers, personal computers. We have desktop publishing. We can research online, and we have print on demand of books. And so for those who are listening, if you have information, become an author. You can publish one book for $20. So do it. Move your information ahead. Write it. Get it ready. You can just put it in a PDF, submit it. The one this is not an advertisement for them, but there's one called that I use called the Book Patch, thebookpatch.com. And you can write a 125-page book, submit it to them in a PDF, and you will get a book, and it will cost $12 plus shipping. And so all of you can be authors. Write your family history or whatever you want. It's doable off of your computer. So it's a great thing to do. And you can easily sell it if you wanted to on Amazon. Yeah,
you can get Russell's book right on Amazon right now. Absolutely. One thing I'd like to ask the two of you, because we're dealing with 18th century, because this was Virginia territory at the time, how much crossover do you think was there into Virginia records that you may have had to dip into?
Now, phrase that one. Virginia records?
Yeah, Virginia records. Did you find yourself having to dip into Virginia records a lot in order to tell some of the Kentucky story, because it's the 18th century and it was Virginia territory at the time?
Oh, well, sure. Yeah, Kentucky in 1780 was Virginia. And a lot of the settlers were coming particularly from Boudetour, which I think is how you say it, County, Virginia. And yes, there, for example, why did all those people go rushing into Kentucky in 1779 to 1780? And the reason is the Virginia legislature was telling people, get back there and make your claim or lose it. So the people go flooding in. And the Virginia records are great. Every time there's a historical subject, you have to think it through. Where would the records be? If it's British, look at Canadian or English records. And if there are soldiers, the pension records, and were there newspapers? And even if there weren't newspapers at the time, a lot of subjects are touched upon in later newspaper stories. So you could put in like Ruddell's Fort on newspapers.com and come up with a lot of different stories. But you have to put in Ruddell's spelled 3 or 4 different ways to pull it up. So there,
and even arrangement in Kentucky as far as our county evolution, you have to think about what were the parent counties. How do you start that research? You have to go back to our original 3. And as far as getting even further back, yes, think about those resources in Virginia. I mean, yes, it's interesting in Kentucky, we have a lot of crossover documents. So, a lot of documents created here in Kentucky, they stayed in Kentucky, even though they may have been Virginia. But then there's also, don't forget about the Virginia repositories that you have to take a look at, Library of Virginia, and then the county of origin, wherever they came out of, if you know that. So there's a lot of waffling back and forth you have to do if you're going into 18th century Kentucky. Yeah, you got to be aware of the different repositories you may have to.
All right. Somebody just put up on the screen there how to pronounce that county. I'm not even going to try it again, but anyway, it was
Bototote. You can always unmute yourself and tell us if you like.
Bototot.
Bototot. There we go.
Bototot.
Yes, look at that. That's something good today. Oh my gosh. Any last this is not the end of the event today. We're just any final advice, Rachel? We're going to then probably pivot into let the others introduce themselves and kind of asking questions if they've got some. But any other last advice or thoughts from you, Rachel?
Well, I would, at least for the research I was doing, especially, I would definitely emphasize what we talked about earlier, which is that sometimes if you have some little significant piece of bread, and for me, those Draper papers were a really good place to start. And a lot of those sightings I was getting out of other people's books that were quoting the Draper papers. But if I had that breadcrumb of like a date, a place, a person's name, I would actually go forward in time to where there might be more rich records. So later census records, death certificates, once they started appearing, Freedmen's Bureau, USCT, pension records as well. I didn't have to use USCT research so much for the Hart family, the Dolly family research, but I did rely a lot on later 1800s census records, maps, death certificates, newspaper articles. Because amazingly, in the case of Dolly, she lived into her 80s. Her son Frederick apparently made it to 100. And then Henry was in his 70s. And so with long lives, they lived a long enough arc that Frederick was in several different newspapers at different points in his life. So I'd find a later article and then realize, okay, this is the same person I'm looking for. And this shows an even closer possibility that this is her son. And then I would go back further in time. Because again, you don't have much information on this particular population at this early time, but if you can find information maybe from Descendants, then that helps triangulate, towards the earlier time period that you're really researching and where to look. I think even this sort of relates to your question about Virginia, early maps are fascinating. And a lot of early maps, the Revolutionary period maps, weren't necessarily accurate as we would think of them today, but what they do show is the course of movement, human movement. And that to me is always really helpful for creatively thinking about where else you can look for records, because a family that might have come from Virginia down into Kentucky, or Virginia through North Carolina into Kentucky, that gives you a path to look for that information. And I just and the more you have that later understanding, the more you can go back in time. So at least for this time period, if you stay fixated on wanting to find original, primary documents from that period, it's just gonna be a harder find. But if you, because I'm not professional, I just sort of dove in, and I would follow like a beagle, I would just follow what interested me, and I would, wind up 100 years later and work back from that later. So I think that's a rich way to go, because it really uncovers more material.
Yes.
So, I have a lot of different pieces of research that have come about because of being able to get those crumbs from later in the century, and then working backwards.
Really important you mentioned, because when you were talking about like later census, don't forget everybody that, some of the later census records, they're asking them, where were their parents born? That kind of thing. That's going back in the generation there. And then also commemorations are important. There's so many, especially, 50 years later, whatever. Think about like 26, we had the Jubilee, and then, then 100th anniversary centennial. Think about all of those different time frames. So like if you're looking in your newspaper, looking in the newspapers, and you're wanting to find something about your person who lived in the 18th century. Oh, I can't find anything in the 18th century. I guess there's nothing there. As Rachel said, move forward, keep moving forward, because don't lock your search parameters in a lot of these newspaper places, because they literally could have told their story. Sometimes a commemorative birthday, they would be interviewed by a local newspaper and they would tell their story, especially if they're living into longevity. And so that is so important to expand. Don't limit yourself, even though you're researching 18th century, expand, especially if those people lived into or had children who lived into the 19th century. Keep researching forward. And that's absolutely. We do see there is a question down there. Did Dolly live to be emancipated?
We don't know exactly. I don't even know her birth year exactly. There's just no way to, I have not been able to dictate that for sure, to determine that for sure, but we think she was in her 80s and died probably in the 1840s. She was likely living on or near the James French property, which is in the Winchester area, Montgomery County. It's likely that she was buried on the French farm in an unmarked grave. That cemetery is intact. There's potential that there's money being put into looking into how many unmarked graves are in that cemetery. That's not a project I'm working on, but I think that that's a possibility that she's there. I could not uncover any evidence that she was ever emancipated. But what I have guessed is that because she was basically spent her life moving with the women members of the Calloway family who married into the French family, it's likely that Dolly was with them. Because there was no evidence that Dolly ever went to Frankfurt to live with Frederick. I think she was probably still enslaved. But Frederick did earn his freedom in Frankfurt while he was living at the Orlando Brown estate. He was freed. He earned enough money as a carriage driver and as a worker to actually free his wife and children, and they later moved to Elyria, Ohio. I don't have particular dates on Dolly, but I do have better dates on Frederick. So I think he was 1775 to 1876 or something. That I'm not sure. His birthstone, there's a couple of conflicting records, and that's something I wanted to say about conflicting records. So about old newspapers, they're fantastic. As far as what Cheri said, like if you go to small town newspapers like in Lincoln County, I looked at a lot of newspapers from the 70s when they were doing a lot of research into the bicentennial, for the bicentennial. But you have the problem of a lot of word of mouth historians or people that really aren't necessarily getting that information from primary sources. So what I was finding, if I was looking at old newspapers or accounts, verbal accounts from the mid to late 20th century, is that sometimes they weren't accurate. So you really do want to make sure you put a pin in that, you make a copy of whatever it is, and then you look elsewhere to see if you can make sure that the facts in that piece are accurate. It's always best to have 2 or 3 pieces of information that tell you the same thing before taking the leap and saying, yeah, this has got to be the case, because unfortunately, a lot of early newspapers they couldn't fact check everything, and people were just saying this is how it is and taking it their word. Right.
And that's the thing. It's almost like, I don't want to say you can go too far ahead, but in a way, it's almost like there's a little bit of a sweet spot there. Like if you've got within, one generation, now granted, that can also have errors. That can, how it is, how we listen to the previous generation. Sometimes we get half part, especially when we were younger, we weren't necessarily listening as well as we should have. We can get some things wrong. So we don't always necessarily
different
right. Exactly. But especially when you start to get into like 2 generations past or whatever, like you were talking about the 1970s. Yeah, definitely look at that with, take that with a grain of salt, because that can absolutely be very erroneous or just complete fiction, depending on who's telling the story. So yeah, be careful about what it is what kind of an account you are getting. We did have a question about they have tax records when with Virginia. Let's see. I'm going to put in here a lovely resource. This is from publication Kentucky Ancestors. And there's an article here on tax lists for Kentucky. And this was written by Candy Atkinson, our goddess of land records in Kentucky. Yes. This was an article she wrote back in 2009 in the print edition of. So this gives you an early tax list history of when Kentucky became a state, 1792. Now, anything pre, I know, anybody have any information? Linda Colston, have you seen anything earlier than that in when we were Virginia? Anything? She's probably sleeping now. Linda Colston, are you awake?
I'm awake. I'm awake. There are early Virginia tax lists, depending on the location and some stuff as far as, again, like Kentucky, you got to be careful of the counties because the counties change. And sometimes what you think may be in one county is actually in another county, especially as you're going back in time.
Are you seeing them in Kentucky County? Like, because they would have been recorded in Kentucky before statehood. Are they in the Kentucky counties or are they over on the Virginia side? Like in Virginia?
They're going to be in the county they were at the time the taxes were collected. So if it was Virginia, it would be that county. Now, I do know over at KDLA, they have, now here I go, I'm going to try to say this word, Botetourt, and Fincastle records. They have some records over in there that were technically Virginia's, but we've got them at the Library and Archives. So,
and for those of you who have never met Linda Colson, you introduce yourself. She is a professional genealogist. She and I used to work at the Kentucky Historical Society together, so for years. And so yours, oh gosh, is it Twin Oaks Genealogy?
Yeah, twinoaksgenealogy.com.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I've done a lot of the early, in various places, the early tax lists and stuff. And sometimes you got different types. You've got the poll taxes, and then you've got the land taxes. So sometimes you got different sets of taxes to look at as well. But where there's money, there's going to be government involvement some way.
Yes. And that's what's so crazy about the Virginia period is that just think about too, like even marriages, you know what? If they were here getting married, they're filing it here. It's usually staying, the records are usually staying here. So there's a lot on the Kentucky side, even though we were Virginia at the time. And of course, I always say, if you can't find that, it's like, oh, well, I know they were here. I know they were, check the Virginia records. You never know what ended up over there too.
But yeah, some of the earliest counties like Bourbon County, Jefferson County, they do have some of the early records that would have belonged to Virginia, but obtained in Kentucky.
Madison, Lincoln.
Yeah.
Yeah. I relied on a couple of wills that were, Virginia era wills. And those wills, sometimes have such great detailed information about people, items, sort of describing the land. They might describe creeks, if you're interested in a specific geology area, or if you're looking for someone's name. I mean, sometimes wills can be a really rich source of tangential information.
Court cases can be
And
wonderful.
the court cases.
Now you've got to realize too that Virginia kind of referred to them a little different than Kentucky does. But when you get into some of those court cases, you can learn a lot, find out a lot of interesting things.
I had to laugh. You mentioned the wills, Rachel. There was one of my favorite wills, and I can't tell you who she was because I can't remember. I may have read about it in Kentucky Ancestors, but I don't remember. But there was one will that I had to laugh because it was a woman. She was a widow, but she, was coming up her time, and her will was so full of every family heirloom that you could imagine. I mean, she told grandpa's sword, she had grandma's teapot, she had and she told him who it belonged to and who I wanted to go to. And I was like, this is amazing. This is, mid-19th century, and she's documenting all of these pieces. I'm like, I hope the family kept these things because here it is documented. The provenance is actually documented right here in this will. So yeah.
I actually used a stretch of a will in a song because what I was really trying to get across was that at the time, enslaved people were objects. So they were listed in an inventory in a will along with a plow and an iron pot and, a piece of chain. And then all of a sudden there's 5 people's names. So that's a very heavy, reference, but I just found that listing the inventory of another era where people are included in inventory is a very powerful way to relay the time. So I just used a stretch of one of my ancestors' wills inventory to kind of get that across.
And as Linda said, the court records, she and I worked on a TV show once upon a time, Kentucky Ancestors, and and this would have been an 18th century family that came in, settled in Maysville area, which is Washington where they actually settled. But and I mean, the patriarch of the family died intestate, and sorry, my Siri is trying to answer the question. And so he died intestate, and it wasn't except for a court case where all of the heirs were then suing one of the oldest children because he had hired out the enslaved people that they had. And so they needed to sue to get their share. And so this entire family unit of enslaved people, who was the mother, who were her children, the children were sick. This is the next daughter. She had these kids. That was an enslaved family's genealogy. Now, sadly, we do know that they were sold in the 1840s, I believe, something around there. And so we have no idea what happened to them. But my goodness, if anybody ever stumbles upon, or they're looking for enslaved families in that area, that's just literally as a court case, they would have missed the wills, they missed the probate records, but there was a court case, drug it all out. And it was wasn't it almost, was it 10 years later or something like that? It was quite a few years later. So again, broaden your horizons, broaden your scope of research, because there'll be a lot out there.
And you can get tickled at some of them. Because I came across one will, and basically in the will, the woman's father left stuff to her, but the absolutely was not to give any of it to her husband because he did not like her husband. So everything was to go to her. And I mean, he spelled that right out in the will. It's like, okay, there was friction in that family.
Just a little.
Just a hair.
I think at this point, we got just a little bit, about a half an hour left. If we want to kind of go around the room, I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Linda, just say where you are, just in case people, especially if we got people joining outside of Kentucky, they don't know where, and kind of your little background. And then everybody will just kind of go around the room. Those who want to participate, it's not mandatory, but those who want to participate, say, introduce yourself, say where you are and what Kentucky branches you might be researching. And then you guys have any questions, specific, especially for Rachel and Russell, go ahead and dive in, ask us questions so we can kind of get those taken care of in the next half hour.
Okay. I'm Linda Colston, and I currently live in Franklin County, so I'm right here at the Capitol. So it's just a very short distance to get to KDLA and the History Center. The paternal side of my family was from basically Eastern Kentucky. My husband's side of the family was from kind of Central Kentucky. Now, my maternal side was from Michigan. So my dad went up there for work, and then we came back down here. So I am a descendant of Daniel Boone's sister, Sarah. So I guess we're cousins there, Russell.
Yes.
But yeah, Kentucky research can be a lot of fun.
Mhm.
And for those of you outside the state, KDLA is the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives. So that's our state archive there. They're the official repository for state government. So a lot of those court records are going to be right there. And I know we talk about how many things are online these days, but as far as court records and things, a lot of those have not been digitized. I'm looking for the word digitized. So there's still a lot to be discovered in state archives and things like that. And then the History Center.
Yeah, you can learn guardianship information and stuff in some of those court cases. I'm just doing a project. I photocopied about 38 court cases for a colleague. And now I'm trying to go through those and get them ready for her. But you come across a lot of neat things in those loose papers. A lot of things you might not find otherwise, especially if the books did not survive.
Don't forget those also locality, the location, more specific location, like the counties, courthouses and things. Sometimes there were books that got put in a closet, didn't always get to the state archives. And then there's also, don't forget, local churches and things like that. So it's always worth it to, take a deep dive, boots on the ground kind of approach. Once the online stuff runs out, definitely worth it to do some in-person research too. So next on my list, I see Arlene. Arlene, you want to introduce yourself?
Are you talking to me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I live in Minnesota. My third great grandfather on the census said he was born in 1787 in Virginia. And I would like to know more about him. He served in the War of 1812. It was out of Bourbon County, I believe, where he enlisted. So I would love to know what I could find in Kentucky if I drove down there, and how long would I need to stay?
You're going to find a lot,
Yeah.
but you can do a lot ahead online, I think.
Well, but one downside is that we do not have a lot of the military records for 1812.
Mm-hmm.
They decided the powers that be that were running the state at that time decided they needed more room. And so they got rid of a lot of the 1812 records.
I do have his pay stubs from the National Archives.
That's good.
Yeah, but I'd like to know a little bit more about, I'd really like to find out who his parents were. Since he was born in 1787, they must have been in the United States.
And
so-
we would have been Virginia then.
Yeah,
No, you said 97? 1792.
1887.
87. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So depending on where they came over, I mean, Bourbon County is rich, as Rachel mentioned. Bourbon County's got a lot of records. Of course, that's one of our early counties. And so,
And they do have some court records online through Family Search.
Where, okay, where,
FamilySearch.org.
yeah, but where would they be? Is it court records or genealogy, a genealogy site?
FamilySearch.org.
Mhm. Yeah, I know what you're talking about,
Okay.
but,
probably not through search is my guess. Are they indexed yet, or is it available through the back
There
end?
is an index on there for some Bourbon County Circuit Court records. However, that index is invalid now, as I found out the other day. They've got a new index for that. But if you go into keyword on FamilySearch.org,
yeah,
that's my favorite one. And I just put in Kentucky Bourbon Court and, comma between them, and then just put that in, and that should bring up the court records that they have available online.
okay, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah,
There might be something for the Adjutant General report for the War of 1812. I know there are for the Mexican War and the Civil War.
We do, well, I say we do, but K8 Kentucky History Center, I know, has that for 1812.
In terms of a place, if you come down here, that you could try the Kentucky State Archives and in Frankfort, and the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort, and they have an excellent Kentucky room, they call it, at the Lexington Public Library. Cheri, maybe at your library, you've got some records, but the Adjutant General usually is the place for state records of military units.
And now there's a couple things I will note. Ironically, our library doesn't have a ton of Kentucky. We have a very small Kentucky section because we focused on all the United States. And so, we only have a little section. So yes, you would mention the Historical Society and KDLA in Frankfurt. So state capital, if you come down in, that's actually a really great place to start, because you can, especially if your family branched out a little bit, you can kind of cover more than one county really quickly in either place. And of course, KDLA is going to have more of the original like court records and different things like that, or deeds if they haven't been, microfilmed or digitized or whatever. So spend a lot of time in the state capital, to get, and then Bourbon County is only, a couple counties over. So, and then it's worth it, to kind of go over there and also get a sense of Bourbon County. It's beautiful. I lived in Bourbon County for 10 years. It's a great place.
so
Franklin County, the Franklin County, Kentucky room in the Frankfurt Library is great also. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
where is the Historical Society? What city?
Frankfurt.
Frankfurt.
Yes.
And it's FORT, Frankfurt. Like
Okay.
we get a lot of people want to speak like Germany. So
And the state capital is in Frankfurt?
that's Frankfurt.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a funny little thing about Frankfurt is it was really named Frank's Ford early on, named after the ford where the three counties met early on in the early years to conduct business and stuff. And it was right there in Kentucky, in Frankfurt area. And it started out as Frank's Ford, but it evolved into Frankfurt now.
So I'm gonna, on my next screen, I see Phil. Hey, Phil, you want to introduce yourself to us? Tell us where you're coming from. Ask any questions you got.
Hi, I'm Phil Amick. I actually now live in Allegheny County, Virginia, which is next door to Botetourt County. So I've only been here 6 months. I'm still learning how to pronounce everything. But I have several lines, Dennis's, Downey's, and Robertson's. They go back to Washington and Mercer and Boyle County in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And I've got a note in a book that was written in 1888 that tells me that Nathaniel Robertson, who'd be my fourth great grandfather, was kidnapped by Indians and held for 3 years. And that's
Wow.
all I know. That didn't come down.
Oh my gosh.
And so I
What's
don't
his
know
name?
when.
Robertson? Robertson
Yeah.
was his name?
Well, it's Robertson or Robinson or Robeson. None of them could read and write. And so it wasn't until, I mean, the next guy down, Daniel Boone Robertson, he went into the Union Army as a Robinson and came out as a Robertson. So
But that story you're telling sounds a lot like Ruddell's Ford and Martin Station. That name is not listed, but a lot of names are not listed because they're not known any longer. But that the story you're telling could be
yeah, well,
there.
yeah, I don't know for sure if they were in Kentucky or in Virginia when it happened, because the father was in the Revolutionary War. He was in Virginia, so I think maybe it was later than what the Ruddell's Fort was. But I just thought, I don't.
In my family, who lived at Hoy Station, which is not too far from Boonesborough, two of the young boys were kidnapped. One was gone for a year, and the other was gone for like 5 years, and they were taken west by Shawnee. And apparently the lore is that when the older boy came back, was returned, he really couldn't, he didn't communicate very well anymore in English. And he was very acculturated to the new culture he had been in.
Yeah,
but those kidnappings were fairly frequent in Kentucky, especially from these small forts or stations. Family.
Yeah, so do they show up in county histories? Do they show up in just in folklore? I mean, this is a story in my family that didn't get handed down, and I'm trying to find some trace of it. I mean, there's not a database.
More tangential. Yeah, the folkloric histories that what I didn't tell too is that I kind of got started in Boonesborough research because of a family tale about girls being kidnapped, and that I was descended from one of those girls. And those would be the Callaway girls at Fort Boonesborough, who were kidnapped along with one of the Boone girls. Well, as it turns out, and this is what started my research, I don't descend from either of those two girls. I descend from their mother, who had an older boy that I was actually a descendant from. So that took a year to determine what was accurate there. But the kidnapping stories are something that people have always loved to tell. And so you'll find those in a lot of different sources. But again, the accuracy of some of the telling of those stories is not always there. So I had to work on that one for a while and read a lot of different tellings of the same kidnapping story to determine who were these girls and who did they marry and who were their kids. Anyway.
Draper
they did
manuscripts
survive.
might be good.
Yes.
Draper manuscripts might be a good place to look. They do tell a
To
lot
look
of
for
Indian
that story.
tales.
And
Thank you.
ironically, another one too, some of the accounts from the legislature, I think, are also another one that people forget about looking at, because there's there's many reasons why. I mean, there's many stories that are told, accounts that are in is Kentucky's a state, early statehood, that kind of thing. And because different issues, different things came up, and they would mention people. However, there was one when divorces at the time, if it was pre-1850, had to be approved by the legislature. And there was one entry, I want to say 1804, and I cannot remember exactly what her name was, but she was a captive Cherokee. She married a chief. They had like 3 kids or so. She was getting a divorce, but the reason why she was getting a divorce was because she had talked her husband into allowing her to go back up into Kentucky to visit her parents with the kids. And as soon as she got here, her parents were like, "You're getting a divorce. Period. End of story. You're going to get a divorce." Like, that's how that was going down. And so there was an account in there about that whole story. And so it's really amazing, the little surprising little pockets of things that you will uncover through various resources.
Another source that I keep forgetting about, but it can be totally awesome for a lot of the early records, are the congressional records. because a lot of times in those early years, people would write the government. You know, they would write to the government to settle a dispute of something they had, to argue why they did not get the Revolutionary War pension, stuff like that. And it would go through their congressmen and stuff, the representatives in DC. And so it's the Congressional Record Series, I think is the name of it. It's been a little bit since I've looked into it. But they
Thank you.
even give, some of them give genealogies. I mean, I saw one record that was the entire nice family history of the family at the time, kids and all. It was really good.
Wow.
Also, I just looked up where I read more about the Hoy kidnappings, and it was from Filson Club or Filson Historical Society Quarterly from the mid-90s. It was an article by Ann Crabb, whose research also helped me in what I was doing. But I think the Filson does have they have a long history of publishing these sort of subject-oriented short pieces, and that may be another place that you could find more of that kind of story-based.
And also
first
too,
person.
like, especially with journals like that, you may not find the journals necessarily in archive or Internet Archive or Hathy, but you might find those in JSTOR as well. JSTOR is another one that was the earlier.
JSTOR.
And you just create your own free account. Sometimes they'll limit you as far as how many you can read at a time or whatever. But yeah, JSTOR is another really good source for those earlier published issues that, pre whatever, 26, 27, where we are right now with.
And I hate to state the obvious, but you mentioned how many different spellings of your family name there might have been. I mean, the first thing I would probably do is just sit there at Google and enter Robertson kidnapping, Robinson kidnapping, every spelling, and maybe Kentucky if you think it was Kentucky or Virginia, whichever, and just be patient and look through 28 pages of the Google search, because you're going to eventually find something, and it might be a book on Google Books, or it might be from one of these sources we've mentioned. But just a Google search will sometimes find those couple of keywords and lead you to a new place to look. But again, trying all those different spellings of the name is probably going to be critical.
Yeah, there's been other Robertsons that were kidnapped that weren't mine, so it gets complicated. So.
Yeah.
So moving down the line, Heather, do you want to introduce yourself and make any comments or questions about Kentucky ancestry?
Did you say Susan?
I said Heather, but Heather's not saying anything. So Susan, you can jump right in.
Okay. My journey began several decades ago trying to discover whether my maiden name with my sister was Scotch or Irish. To this day, we don't know definitively whether we're Scotch or whether we're Irish, but it has led us back in time, as far back as Virginia in 1655, where William Grinstead married a biracial woman who I believe was one of the first 22 Blacks that were forcefully immigrated into Virginia at that time. So that's been a really, really interesting story. Our biggest connection with Kentucky, though, is through a William Hall, who married one of his descendants married Grinstead. I would like somehow or another to be able to connect William. I do find him in the list of settlers. I do find a William Hall in the list of settlers in Boonesborough, and I believe that to be our ancestor. He had a son, Squire, who we surmise may have been named after Daniel's brother, Squire Boone, and that is our descendant. William actually was an American Revolutionary soldier in the Continental Line from Pennsylvania, and he then traveled through Kentucky into Boonesborough. We find William Hall again in Louisville with George Rogers Clark. So we believe that that's our William. However, being able to conclusively conclude that that's our William, although he's the only one that we find and that we know that he was in Kentucky about that time. But William Hall winds up, I think, going through Shelby County, Kentucky, and eventually comes across the river and is the first white settler in a little town those around Kentucky might remember as Madison, Indiana. So we've gotten a lot of good information. Still trying to put pieces and parts of it together to completely confirm what it is. And someday we may even be able to say, yes, we are Scottish.
Awesome. Good luck on your journey. We know it's complicated. So, next on my list, I see Sid. Sid, did you want to introduce yourself and ask any questions?
No questions. I'm here. I'm a newly appointed registrar for my SAR chapter, and I thought I might glean some information here that would be helpful. And there are plenty of things in the chat that I think I can file away for further use.
Absolutely. And afterwards, by the way, this is being recorded. We will put it up on the SAR YouTube channel. And then all of the different sources that we mentioned, I usually take those and I put them in the description of the video. So you can go right back and click on those. You can bookmark this and go back or just copy that list. And anybody also attending, there's nothing you can do. You can also save the chat while you're attending. You can, that way you get that automatically. But again, the resources we talk about are going to live on. So, which is our main purpose really is to make sure we educate and we leave that around for others to learn some more. Deb, did you want to introduce yourself or questions or anything?
Yes. Hey, I live in Colorado now. I've been here for about 30 years, grew up in Florida, but my mom was born in Kentucky in Martin County, and my dad was across the river in West Virginia on leave, and that's how they met. But all of my family lines go to colonial times, and really in the mid-Atlantic from Pennsylvania down to northern part of North Carolina and going west. But my mom's family, there's notoriety with the steps. There's a historical marker and from Moses Step. But anyway, on my dad's side of the family, my Harrison's married with the Harmons, and supposedly Matthias Harmon, which is my 5 times great grandfather, traveled around with Daniel Boone. And also there's a book about Harmon Station, which it's been described as the first English speaking station in Kentucky or fort. And I don't always see it that way when people talk about the different stations and forts in Kentucky, but this book does it. It's written by a William E. Connolly, and it's the foundings of Harmon Station. I think there's another book too, but I don't remember where I've seen where he had traveled with Daniel, but they did live around the same time. And was also notorious. Yeah.
And you had mentioned that. I thought, oh, Harmon Station, where am I hearing that one from? And that one really jogged my memory. So yeah, the founding of Harmon Station. And you mentioned the author was a Connolly. I'm descended from the Connollys. I've forgotten that Harmon Station was down around Paintsville. So I just put a little link to anybody wanted to kind of get a little bit of bearing on that. That's there's a historical marker about Harmon Station and where it is. It's in Johnson County. So yeah, I had family from Johnson, Floyd, and McGoffin County. So that's where one of my branches comes out of. So yeah.
Cool. I just copied the link. That he actually died in Tazewell County, Virginia. So that's my dad's family, the Harrisons. They have roots from Botetourt, Montgomery, Augusta County, and so forth. And, those old families, colonial times. So got a lot of history around that area. It's amazing that, 250, 300 years ago. So but I don't know most of the origins, what country they came from. By DNA, I know the Harrisons are from England, around Birmingham, but some of the others I'm still researching. But I know I got German ancestry, Scott Irish, which were Irish at the time, Northern Ulsters, of course, English and so forth. So I'm finding this conversation, I'm learning, more about the history of Kentucky. So it's been an interesting time spending with you guys.
Wonderful. Thanks for
Thank
coming. We have got just a few minutes left, and if anybody has any last minute questions, let us know. Or if our two guests want to comment on anything, I will ask, Rachel, you said you were still working on Dolly's story a bit, or producing something about Dolly's story, correct? Do you want to give us a little sneak peek what's your plan, I guess, basically moving forward with that?
Well, it just keeps unfolding. As I said, her son Frederick had manumitted himself and his family, and they moved to Northern Ohio. And his son Henry was educated as a musician and was very successful. One of the very first really successful print published composers of African American history. He was a band leader, violinist, played on the riverboats. I think he and his father had been involved in what we now call the Underground Railroad. So there's to me, there's a lifetime left of research to do there, because that, again, it takes a lot of sideways research to kind of determine what was happening. But what I have been focusing on is Henry's daughters. They were all musically educated, and some played in his band. Some were, very successful classical musicians, teachers, educators, principals. Their stories are incredibly fascinating because they were living in the 20th century and in some cases passing for white, which we know the complication in that kind of cultural story is that, in order to have better success and more opportunities, sometimes people would try to pass as white to play in better orchestras, for instance, or live in a better part of town. So there's an incredible story there that's unfolding. And I've managed to meet a few of her descendants, Dolly's descendants, that are members of this Hart family. So actually speaking to those people on the phone has been so fun. I'm helping them learn more about their family. They're sharing with me different things that I hadn't been able to uncover. So the story just keeps on going. And I don't know where it's leading exactly, but I have made more sections of the film that explore this aspect of the ongoing legacy of Dolly and her descendants. It's just not exactly public yet, but I'm still working on it and trying to figure out what form it will come out into the world. The signage at Fort Boonesborough is a huge moment.
That's awesome.
So that is real, and I'm very excited about that.
Keep us posted if you posted on the film as it grows, or as you produce more, if you ever that ever becomes available again, or even just the hour-long one that you had done. Let us know, especially as the 250s is coming up. There's a lot to tell with all of that story too.
Thank you. Yes,
it means to be American. All that goes with that. So some deeper undertones, I think, for Dolly's story too, that you can, aim for a little bit. So yeah, coming up. And then Russell, everybody go buy Russell's book. You can get that on Amazon anytime. And are you writing any more books? Are you in the middle of writing another one, or?
Well, yes, that's what I do, once I retired. And I did write a book, another Kentucky book about an ancestor of mine named David Calvin Bledsoe, who was in the 22nd Kentucky Infantry Union in the Civil War. And he had a sunstroke collapse during the Vicksburg campaign, and his health was totally lost. After the war, though, he couldn't get a pension. And it's the story of his 30-year effort to get a pension, but they wouldn't recognize it because he was he didn't have a scar. He was not shot. And anyway, it's just what I do. I do have a book I'd like to mention for Rachel called Abby Guy, ABBY GUY. Mm-hmm. And that is the story. It's a book I wrote, my first one after I retired, about a slave in Arkansas who in 1854 sued to be freed because she was claiming that she was white. And she won the jury trial. It went to the Arkansas Supreme Court and was reversed. She was re-enslaved. They had another trial. They had another trial with a hung jury. And then they had a third trial, and she was declared white and free again. And it was the issue of, you know, I'll say it in terms of Russian czars. Are we running? We're out of time, so I'll talk to you about that afterward.
And there's another one actually that reminds me. There's another one. Charity Southgate was another one that she was brought over from Virginia. She was free in Virginia because she was born of a free white mother. Her father was enslaved, and then her family, once they got her into Kentucky, they decided to enslave her again. Basically, treated her like a slave, and so she sued them, took them to court. She won. She won her case. So that's actually up in the Pendleton County area, or at least that's where she resided. I think she was brought down more into bluegrass area, but yes. So there's several. I love those stories. Those are fantastic. So anyway, but yes, thank you guys so much. We are out of time, but this has been wonderful. Thank you guys so much for joining us and everybody that attended. And again, share with friends. Once it goes up, it usually takes about a week, almost 2 weeks sometimes to get them up onto the YouTube channel, but I'll let you guys know when it's up. You guys can share around with people to teach them more about 18th century Kentucky. So thank you all so
Cheri.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.